I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone here to this weekend VIPASHYANA retreat based on this insight into emptiness. This is the fifth and last in a series of 5 retreats based on the 3 core areas of practice of mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom. The first 2 retreats were all about cultivating mindfulness, the shamatha practice. Then we did the 3rd retreat was on compassion practice. And the previous retreat was also a Vipassana retreat based on these 3 marks of existence. And so we can see the relationship between these 3 core areas of practice in that we can talk about the 2 main wings of practice of wisdom and compassion, or Vipassana and compassion. And both of these practices are on the basis of shamatha, of mindfulness, of first cultivating a calm, clear, focused mind, and then we can engage in these 2 core areas of practice. And we saw there in the Vipassana wing of practice, the foundation level is these 3 marks of existence, which is what we covered in the last retreat. We'll be building on those in this retreat in the Mahayana level of this wisdom of emptiness. And then in the compassion wing of practice, we saw the 4 immeasurables were the foundation practices, and we can build on that with this bodhicitta, where we looked at this exchanging self with others practice. The schedule for this weekend will have 4 sessions each day. All of the sessions will be 1 hour 15 long. The 2 morning sessions this morning, that's of course if you're in Europe, in Central European summertime, then we'll have 2 morning sessions with a 30-minute break in between. We'll have a 1-hour break for lunch, and then the similar program in the afternoon, 2 sessions with a 30-minute break, finishing at 4 p.m. Again, if you're in Europe. And the same schedule for tomorrow. And we see some of the main topics here that we'll be covering in the 8 sessions that we'll be doing this weekend. First, an introduction into this view of emptiness, then looking at what's called dependent arising. A 3rd session about how we make boundaries. The 4th about how to find the middle way. 1st session tomorrow morning, looking at the nature of mind. And then some short-term strategies together with the Vipassana practice. Summary of practice in the 3rd session, and then the importance of having an integrated approach to practice in the last session tomorrow. Session structure as normal, we'll begin with guided meditation, presentation of a topic, another guided meditation, and Q&A at the end of the session. For the Q&A, again, if you prefer, you can type your questions in the chat and then Martina will read them out. Or if you prefer, you can directly ask the question by switching on your webcam and mic during the Q&A part of the session. The recommended reading for this program, for this retreat, is How to See Yourself as You Really Are from His Holiness Dalai Lama. Very good book, introductory book into this practice of emptiness. The course materials or the retreat materials, we have 2 charts there, the suffering and its causes. We'll be looking at that in quite some detail today and tomorrow. A lot of focus on that chart. The Mahayana Path chart we'll look at briefly, I think, in the 3rd session tomorrow. And then in the last session tomorrow, in terms of integration, we'll be looking at a little bit at this article here called Mental Balance and Wellbeing from Alan Wallace. So we'll be drawing on that article a little bit in the last session tomorrow. So that brings us to the 1st session, an introduction, particularly an introduction into this view of emptiness. So let's begin. In this session, we'll begin with a meditation on loving kindness, particularly toward ourselves and then expanding out to others. And this will serve as a sort of a motivation for this weekend's retreat. Then a little bit of a review in terms of what is Vipassana, which we looked at in the last retreat, the Four Noble Truths, which is the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. So a short, quick review of that. We covered that already in the last retreat. And then we'll look at what's called the perfection of wisdom teachings, which are these teachings on emptiness. So that's the foundation for this Vipassana practice of emptiness. Then we'll briefly introduce the view of emptiness. And then we'll do a meditation with respect to that focusing on the body, and then question answer at the end of the session. So let's begin with the meditation. Again, this will serve as the motivation for this weekend's retreat. Loving kindness, particularly toward ourselves, giving us a sort of a vision for our life, and then expanding out to others. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. Allowing your awareness to descend into the body and simply become aware of sensations throughout the body. And if you notice any areas of tightness or tension in any part of the body, then use the out breath to relax and release that tightness or tension. And bringing your awareness to the area of your face and softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. Mouth and jaw, soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes, soft and relaxed. And in this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And then simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. And we can begin to cultivate loving kindness for ourselves by reflecting on 4 points. Now, no matter how much mental afflictions are in your mind, that is, no matter how much craving, attachment, anger, jealousy, and so on are in our mind, these mental afflictions are not part of the nature of our mind. They're merely like dirt covering the surface of our mind. And beneath these mental afflictions is the natural purity of our mind. So imagine this inner purity of your mind in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest at the level of your heart. And then the first point to reflect on is, what are your deepest aspirations in this life? What is your heart's desire? What would you really like to achieve in this life? And try to picture your deepest aspirations very clearly. And then arouse the thought, may I realize my deepest aspirations in this life. And then with each out-breath, imagine rays of light radiating out from the sphere of light at your heart, filling and saturating your entire body and mind. Imagining that your deepest aspirations are being fulfilled right here and now. Now, in order to help you fulfill those highest aspirations, what kinds of material assistance would you like to receive from the world around you? And what kinds of friendship and guidance would you like to receive from the people around you? And then arouse the thought, may I receive everything that I need to help me realize my deepest aspirations. And then with each in-breath, imagine reality rising up in the form of white light, streaming in from all directions, providing you with everything you need. Now, the help that we receive from the world around us is not enough for us to realize the genuine happiness that we seek. For this, inner transformation is essential. So the third point to reflect on is, how would you like to transform and evolve as a person? What faults would you like to be free of? What qualities would you like to cultivate and fully possess? And then arouse the aspiration, may I cultivate the true causes of my own fulfillment. And with each outbreath, imagine the white light of loving kindness radiating out from your heart, filling your body and mind. Imagining that you're actually becoming that person with those qualities and free of those faults right here and now. And then finally, for the sake of your own fulfillment and to make your own life as meaningful as possible, what would you truly love to offer to the world using your own unique talents? And then with each out-breath, imagine the white light of loving kindness radiating out in all directions from your heart as you actualize this offering to the entire world right here and now. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest in that inner purity of mind, which is in the nature of loving kindness. We can bring the meditation to a close and we can begin our discussions here this morning together. We'll start with a little review of some of the points from the last Vipassana retreat. So what is Vipassana? Vipassana is a Sanskrit term. The equivalent Pali term is Vipassana. In both of those terms, the VI prefix means higher or superior, and Pasana or Pasana means to see. So often this is translated as, so literally means higher seeing, seeing beyond, and usually translated into English as either insight or special insight. So Vipassana is the practice of applying mindfulness to gain insights into the nature of reality. And why is this Vipassana practice important? It's because the Buddhist assertion is that the underlying source of our suffering is our mental afflictions, and that our mental afflictions come from our distorted view of reality. And so by gaining an insight into the nature of reality through Vipassana practice, that leads us to overcoming our mental afflictions and suffering, and thus finding that genuine happiness and inner well-being. And we saw there in the last retreat that we have a number of distorted views of reality, and that the four distorted views we're looking at in these two Vipassana retreats are, the first is seeing things which are changing as unchanging, seeing pleasure as happiness, seeing where there is no self a self, and seeing things which are dependent as independent. And so to overcome these four distorted views, we have four insights. So the three insights of impermanence, suffering, and no self were the ones we focused on in the last retreat to help us overcome those first three distorted views. And in this retreat, we're focusing on the insight into emptiness to help us to overcome the distorted view of grasping things which are dependent as independent. So Theravada Buddhist traditions, when they do Vipassana practice, really are focusing on those first three insights. Whereas in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, they are included, but there's a strong emphasis on this insight into emptiness. And that's the what, which is in Sanskrit, shunyata. And that's what we'll be looking at in this retreat. And we saw in the last retreat that the foundation of all Buddhist traditions are these Four Noble Truths. So this gives us the framework for this Vipassana practice. That the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, which is a translation of the Sanskrit and Pali term dukkha, is that the Buddha said that the human condition is one of suffering. But here we need to understand, or we saw that the word dukkha has a much broader meaning than how we normally understand the word suffering. That for us, normally suffering implies some sort of painful, unpleasant experience. But here this word dukkha not only includes that, but it really at the deepest level, it includes the fact that the human condition is such that there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. So sometimes this word is dukkha is translated as unsatisfactory. So in that sense, the human condition is unsatisfactory. It's definitely unsatisfactory in terms of unpleasant experiences because we don't want them. We could even say that our pleasant experiences are unsatisfactory since they're transient and they're unreliable. And at the deepest level, the human condition is unsatisfactory because there's always a potential for suffering to arise. Why is that potential there? That's the second noble truth, is the underlying, the truth of the cause of suffering or dukkha. Why are we in this state? And the underlying cause is the mental afflictions, in Sanskrit, klesha. These, as long as we have these mental afflictions in our mind, there's always a potential for suffering to arise. And we saw there that all the different mental afflictions that we can have can be condensed down to the three main core mental afflictions called the three poisons of ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And here ignorance is an ignorance in terms of distorted view of reality. And so here in the Four Noble Truths, the fundamental ignorance is this grasping to autonomous self. And so therefore, the Buddha's diagnosis for us is that we are stuck in this state of dukkha or suffering due to the mental afflictions, and that we are cycling in this state life after life. And this is called samsara, samsara being a Sanskrit term. The third noble truth, truth of cessation, is the Buddha's prognosis. The Buddha's prognosis is that we can achieve complete liberation from all suffering and its causes. And that state of freedom from all suffering and its causes is called nirvana, or nibbana in Pali. And then the cure, what is the Buddha's cure for us, is the fourth noble truth, truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. And here the classic presentation is the Noble Eightfold Path. And we saw there that those 8 practices can be condensed into these 3 core areas of practice called the 3 higher trainings of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. And that within the wisdom practice or Vipassana practice here in the Four Noble Truths teachings, the classic approach to this are what's called the 4 applications of mindfulness, that we are applying mindfulness to investigate our body, feelings, mind, and phenomena, to come to these 3 insights called the 3 marks of existence, to come to an insight into impermanence, to see that everything's changing moment by moment, and thereby reducing attachment. Because if we experientially see things as constantly flow, change, there's nothing for attachment to grab hold of. And as we saw in the last retreat, this insight into impermanence leads into all the other insights of suffering, no self, and emptiness. So it really provides a good basis for the other insights. The insight into suffering, the insight into our human condition, and in particular, that we are stuck in this state due to our distorted view of reality, and that we can overcome that, will lead us to develop this renunciation, which is this wish or aspiration to be free of suffering, and thereby also help to develop compassion for others, understanding that everyone else is also in the same situation as ourselves. And then finally, the insight into no self then will help us to reduce and eliminate all mental afflictions and suffering and achieve that goal of nirvana. And so that brings us now to what's called the perfection of wisdom. So the perfection of wisdom in Sanskrit is prajna paramita. And so this is a system of teachings that the Buddha taught where he sort of built on the Four Noble Truths. So in the Four Noble Truths, the fundamental ignorance is this grasping to self, and not so much mention about how the world exists out there. In fact, it does exist as it appears. Whereas here in the Prajna Paramita, perfection of wisdom teachings, the Buddha went on to say that, well, not only do we grasp onto a self, we overinflate a false sense of me, but we also don't see reality correctly, the world. That actually the world does not exist as it appears. Even though there seems to be an independent, objective world out there, the world does not exist as it appears. And so this is this idea of emptiness, that nothing exists independently. And so to introduce this topic of emptiness here, I'd like to read a little bit from a section in a book called Tibetan Buddhism from the Ground Up, a book by Alan Wallace. And the section on his book is What is Really There? And he says the following. Many of us believe that we directly perceive objective physical phenomena with our 5 physical senses, that the mental images we perceive via our senses are accurate representations of the objects we perceive. However, neurologist Antonio Damasio refutes this assumption, which is commonly called naive realism. So now he's quoting the neurologist who says, when you and I look at an object outside of ourselves, we form comparable images in our respective brains. We know this well because you and I can describe the object in very similar ways, down to fine details. But that does not mean that the image we see is the copy of whatever the object outside is like. Whatever it is like in absolute terms, we do not know. In light of this neuroscientific view, with our 5 senses, we directly perceive images generated in the brain. But these are not truly representations of anything existing independently of the brain. These sensory impressions of colors, sounds, smells, and so on are no more tangible than thoughts or dreams. While we seem to experience colors and so on as they exist in the objective world, independent of our senses, this is an illusion, very much like a dream. So now, of course, it's Alan Wallace talking again. He's saying, having determined that the reality we perceive depends on our sense faculties, what then really does exist outside our senses? When we close this book and leave the room, shutting the door behind us, what remains? It is an ancient question that has been asked since the time of the Greeks. What exists behind appearances? What really exists out there? This brings up a familiar problem. What happens when a tree falls and nobody is in the forest to watch it or hear it? Most people agree something happened. The tree trunk is on the ground, there is a big dent, things start to rot, and ants and termites live in the fallen trunk. But what happened? Western scientists have traditionally responded to this question by trying to find primary or intrinsic qualities of the falling tree that can be measured. Mass is one of those. The idea being that the tree has a quantifiable amount of stuff to it. Speed is another quality that does not seem to depend on anyone's perception. Briefly considering the history of Western scientific thinking on this point may be a useful digression that may help us better understand the nature of emptiness. Also, by examining our cultural assumptions about the nature of reality, we can better understand and penetrate those assumptions, and by so doing, come to appreciate the Buddhist view. Since Galileo took his telescope and turned it on Jupiter, scientific thought has increasingly depended on the power of mechanical instruments. We get the sense, and it is widely promoted by science, that by using mechanical instruments and mathematics, we stop being subjective and instead become objective. Everyone knows the senses can be misleading, it is said. So let us dispense with the senses. They are only giving us appearances anyway, and we're trying to penetrate through those. The idea of objective measurement came to be strongly emphasized during the time of Galileo. And by the end of the 19th century, scientists felt the objective science of physics was virtually complete. The physics of the time was assumed, with very few exceptions, to be an absolute representation of what was really out there. At the beginning of the 20th century, this view began to break down. Scientists started to understand more clearly that their instruments of measurement were themselves contributing to the data they were detecting. But the real revolution came with the development of quantum physics, which investigates the very smallest components of physical reality. It is here that the participatory nature of measurement and experimentation becomes most obvious. In quantum mechanics, attributes of mass, speed, shape, and location vanish as purely objective entities. All of them can only be seen in relationship to the methods of measurement. As the renowned physicist Werner Heisenberg said, "What we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning." As scientists looked still deeper, they also started questioning the objectivity of the analytical tools they use. Mathematics, for instance, is one more human creation. Euclidean geometry is only one of a theoretically infinite number of geometries that can be used. And the same goes for algebra and for various logic systems. The subjective element seems to be inescapable on all fronts. In no facet of science, whether we are dealing with astronomy, physics, or medicine, do we get even one bit of information about any reality existing independently of our modes of questioning. All our sensory experience consists of experiences that are contingent upon our sense faculties. Even by reducing everything to the subatomic level of electrons, quarks, and so forth, we are still left with nothing but appearances. What is inescapable is that all we know of the world, theoretically and empirically, consists of appearances to the mind. We have access to nothing else. Understanding this, the concept of reification becomes universally applicable. In the same way that we look out on the world and view perceived objects as if they existed inherently in objective space, so too do we view things like electrons and sound waves as if they existed independently of our conceptions of them. Perceived objects exist in relation to the conceptual schemata within which they are understood. We reify an object by removing it from its context, by ignoring the subjective influences of perception and conception. Okay, so let's have a look at this view of emptiness now. So here in these Perfection of Wisdom teachings, and one of the classic Perfection of Wisdom teachings is the Heart Sutra, very well known in many Buddhist traditions. And here we have a classic line from the Heart Sutra at the beginning, the quote which says, "Form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, form also is not other than emptiness." So that very succinctly puts this view, presents this view of emptiness that we're going to now start to unpack in the coming sessions. And so here in these systems of teaching from the Buddha, the fundamental ignorance, the underlying distorted view of reality is this grasping to independent existence. And so therefore, Vipassana practice, wisdom practice, is to come to realize that everything is empty of independent existence. This is emptiness. And by realizing this emptiness, we can achieve full enlightenment. And a little bit later tomorrow, we'll look at the difference between nirvana and enlightenment. And here we also have a quote from a great 20th century theoretical physicist, John Wheeler, one of the sort of preeminent theoretical physicists of the whole 20th century. He says, useful as it is under everyday circumstances to say that the world exists out there, independent of us, that view can no longer be upheld. There is a strange sense in which this is a participatory universe. So let's now go and look at the view of emptiness. First, terminology. So here we're talking about this idea of independent existence, things existing independently. And in the texts, there are a number of terms which describe this. The most common term you'll probably see is inherent existence. And so the word inherent existence has the idea of things being self-existent, that the world is made up of many separate discrete entities, many separate discrete things, everything having its own unique existence. Another term commonly used is existing from its own side. And this has the idea of things existing from their own side, meaning not needing to have an observer to exist. So existing without an observer. And then another term that is commonly used is true existence. Now, generally something is true if it doesn't deceive us. Now, the world or things appear to exist independent of us. If that's actually how they exist, they would be true, meaning the way in which they exist and the way in which they appear and the way in which they exist matches. So that's what true existence means. True existence means existing in the same way in which it appears. So these are three common terms used to describe independent existence. They all have the same meaning. They're talking about the same thing from slightly different perspectives. Here in the Perfection of Wisdom teachings, the Buddha said nothing exists independently. And the reasoning here is that things are empty of inherent existence, or in other words, things are not independently existent because they are dependently existent. And the term used to describe dependent existence is dependent arisings. Arising here means coming into existence. So things come into existence dependently. And so that's what emptiness means. So this term here, empty of inherent existence, which simply means not inherently existent or not independently existent, is emptiness. The Sanskrit term is shunyata. So emptiness is simply the fact of things being empty of inherent existence or not independently existent. Now, the etymology of this Sanskrit word shunyata, shunya actually is Sanskrit for zero. It can also mean hollow or empty. And the ta suffix is like in English, ness. So emptiness is a very good literal translation. And so here the word, when we talk about hollow or empty, meaning there's no essence to things, there's no, they do not exist from their own side. So actually emptiness is a very good translation of shunyata. So emptiness doesn't mean things don't exist. When we hear the word emptiness, we need to ask empty of what? We're not saying things are empty of existence. We're saying that things are empty of inherent existence, or in other words, they're not independently existent. Why? Because they are dependently existent. In other words, they are dependent arisings. The Sanskrit term there is pratitya samuppada. So therefore, things come into existence dependently. So if we can understand a little bit more about what do we mean by dependent arising, how things come into existence dependently, then we can get a better appreciation of what emptiness means. So let's have a look at dependent arising. We can talk about things coming into existence in three ways. The first of those is causes and conditions, that things come into existence depending on causes and conditions. And here when we talk about causes and conditions, here cause, we can talk about substantial cause, And substantial cause is really the thing which transforms into the result. And that is always of a similar type to the result, meaning the substantial cause of something physical is always physical, and the substantial cause of something mental is always mental. You can't have a mental thing transforming into physical and vice versa. Whereas the cooperative conditions are all the other contributory factors which contribute to that transformation. And they don't have to be of the same type. So we can have mental things being contributing cooperative conditions for something physical and vice versa. So let's have a look at some examples there to really have that clear. What do we mean by substantial cause cooperative conditions? So first we'll use an example of a sprout or a plant. So the substantial cause of the sprout or a plant is the seed, because it's the seed which transforms into the plant. The cooperative conditions are all the various physical and mental factors which contribute to that transformation. The classic ones being the physical ones in terms of soil, sunlight, water, and so forth. But also here we can have mental things, because someone maybe planted that seed. So they had an intention to plant the seed. So that was a contributing condition. And maybe it was a farmer who had a desire to make some money out of a crop. So desire, the farmer's desire, was also a contributing condition for the arising of the sprout of the plant. So that's quite straightforward. Let's use a mental example now, anger. So what is the substantial cause of anger? Is the seed of anger in our mind during the previous moment before anger arose. It's that seed of anger or a habit of anger which transformed, manifested into anger. Whereas the cooperative conditions can be all sorts of various factors, psychological things, physiological, external factors that contribute to the arisal of anger. For example, we need an object for anger. That can either be a person, a thing, or an internal thing. Inappropriate attention. We need to be looking at it in an inappropriate way for it to arise. We could have some cultural conditioning that contributes to anger arising. There could be environmental factors which contribute to anger arising. There even could be some neurological imbalances in the brain which contribute to anger arising. But none of these things are the underlying cause of anger. So therefore, we can't say that person is the cause of my anger. That's not true. That person may have been a contributing condition for our anger to arise, but the underlying cause of our anger is the seed of anger, the habit of anger we had in our mind. That manifested due to seeing a person, and maybe looking at them in an inappropriate way and other factors. That leads to anger arising. So causes and conditions, I think, are fairly straightforward. So let's now briefly look at parts. So things exist depending on their parts. Again, using this sprout example or the plant example, the sprout not only exists depending on causes and conditions, i.e. the seed plus all the contributing conditions, soil, sunlight, water, and so forth, but also the sprout exists depending on its parts. Its parts being the roots, the stem, the branches, leaves, and so on. Without those parts, there is no sprout. So again, that's fairly straightforward. But what we're saying here is that this reasoning of dependent arising should be overturning the fact that things exist independently. But I think most of us are happy to accept that things such as sprouts exist depending on causes and conditions, and things such as sprouts depend on parts, yet there seems to be a sprout existing there objectively at the same time. But that shouldn't be possible, because either a sprout exists dependently or independently. It can't be both. It's either one or the other. But it seems like we can accept causes and conditions and parts, and at the same time accept the idea that there is a sprout existing there objectively, independently of us. And the reason being is that we only understand, if that's the case, then it's because we only understand causes and conditions and parts quite superficially. To understand them at a deeper level, we have to go to the third way in understanding dependent arising. And if we go back to that, that is that things exist depending on labeling, or in some other terms used there, imputation, designation, conception. And so we might think, well, I know what that means. It means there's a thing there which I'm calling a sprout. So again, that's a fairly superficial understanding of labeling. And so we're going to go into that in the next session. We're going to look at what do we mean by labeling at the deepest level, and thereby understand causes and conditions and parts also at a deeper level. But before that, let's do a little meditation to get a little bit of a taste of this emptiness and dependent arising. And we'll use this quote from the Heart Sutra as the basis of the meditation. That quote again was, form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, form also is not other than emptiness. And here form is what's called the form aggregate. And when we're talking about person, that corresponds to the body. So in other words, we can say this statement is saying the body is empty, emptiness is the body, emptiness is not other than the body is also not other than emptiness. So let's see what that really means. So let's do a little meditation to get a little bit of a flavor of emptiness, and also a bit of a flavor of dependent arising, causes, conditions, parts, and labeling. And so that we can use that when we continue our discussions in the next session. So let's do that meditation now, 15-minute practice. If you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. We begin by preparing the body, establishing a good posture, keeping the back nice and straight, and at the same time allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. and setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. In the Heart Sutra, it says, form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, form also is not other than emptiness. Or in other words, it's saying the body is empty, emptiness is the body, emptiness is not other than the body also is not other than emptiness. Let's investigate those statements. How does your body appear to exist? When you say my body, how does the body appear to your mind? Does it appear to be a single thing existing from its own side, independent of everything else? If the body really exists objectively, if it exists from its own side, it should be findable. We should be able to point to it. So when we try to point to the body, where do we point? Maybe we point to the center of the chest. Is there anything there in that area that is from its own side a body? What about the head? Is there anything in a head that is objectively from its own side a body? What about the arms or legs? Is there a body to be found objectively in the arms or the legs? No matter where we look, we just see parts of a body. Is the body then simply the collection of these parts? each part is not a body. And so a collection of all of these parts is a collection of things, none of which is a body. Where is there a body to be found objectively among a collection of things, none of which is a body? Yet, other than merely these parts, what body is there? Hence, the body is empty. However, this does not mean that there's no body at all. The body does exist. Because the body is empty, it can appear and exist. Hence, emptiness is the body. The body exists depending on other factors. The body exists depending on causes and conditions, such as the food we eat and all the bodily processes that are going on. Other than merely this continuous unfolding of causes and conditions, what body is there? And the body exists depending on the parts, such as the chest, head, and limbs. Other than merely these parts, what body is there? The body exists simply as being merely labeled upon these parts. Other than being merely labeled, what body is there? And therefore, since emptiness and the body are like two sides of a single coin, emptiness is not other than the body also is not other than emptiness. And we can bring the meditation to a close. So that was just a little bit of a experiential taste of emptiness and dependent arising. And these two topics we're going to unpack in a lot more detail in the coming sessions. So I thought it'd be helpful to just get a little taste of it so we can relate to it a little bit when we talk about it in the coming sessions. Now we've got time for some question answer before we take a break. So if you'd like to ask any questions, then you can either put it in the chat or you just switch on your webcam and mic and ask away. Doesn't seem like anyone's got any questions. Okay, if there's no questions, then we'll take a break. We'll take a little bit longer break then. So we've got actually 40 minutes break now. So let's take a break. We'll come back to the next session, session 2. We'll look a little bit more at this dependent arising. We'll look at what labeling means and so forth, and try to unpack that a little bit more in the next session. So until then, let's take a break, and I'll see you back in 40 minutes time.